Virtuous, which is virtue.us. And basic thesis here is that digital technologies are changing and undermining virtually every industry world over. Now, I've spent my career either in government or advising governments, and while most people don't think of government as an industry, I've come to do so. And I think that the technologies that are changing everything from the publishing industry to the taxi industry to the lodging industry are going to fundamentally change the business model of government in much the same way. Next slide, please. In fact, this is already happening worldwide. People are finding more ways to say no to paying for government services they don't want, and are being able to choose to unbundle and buy government services that they do want from other governments that they're not geographically part of, and from non-governmental actors as well, including businesses, nonprofits and social service providers, and even terrorist organizations, which actually provide a lot of government services worldwide. Digital technologies are accelerating this trend in all sorts of strange ways that are going to fundamentally change the government marketplace over the next decade or two, in the same way that these technologies have changed virtually every other marketplace. Let's go to the next slide. Now, I think that a lot of people find these thoughts disconcerting in the same way, but even more so, that the demise of the publishing industry and the taxi industry, as we've known them, have come about as a result of technologies in the last decade. In the case of government, I am hopeful that the same technologies that are undermining geographic nation states all over the world right now are also going to allow for the creation of new avenues for providing the same sorts of government services that we came to expect of government in the 20th century, but have been declining over the course of the last 40 years, in much the same way that these technologies allow for new ways of delivering services in private marketplaces. I want to note that in the article in this month's journal that discusses this, I talked about something that I think is becoming an increasing reality nowadays. I wouldn't have said this really 2 months ago, but I think that it's becoming more and more reasonable to expect something of a restoration in November of a prior model that we saw prior to a couple of years, the last couple of years. But governments across the US and worldwide are going to be more fiscally constrained following COVID-19 than they actually have been in the past. And I think that regardless of who is president, we're going to see a continuation of the trends we've seen for the last several decades, which is a further constraint on how government services are delivered and how they can be delivered. So regardless of what happens politically, I think we're looking at a technological and economic trend that we need to take account of and think about what does that mean for the delivery of public goods. Next slide, Nick. All right, so here is a very simple schematic showing the underlying model of what we're talking about with Virtuous. Today, you can basically think of taxpayers rather grudgingly handing over their money to the government, which then provides services to beneficiaries, which one would hope benefits them. But lots of taxpayers don't see it that way because the benefits are diffuse, ranging from things like the money going to the education of other people's children, which some people don't appreciate, to things like the provision of a working public health system, which people don't notice that their money is going for until we have a situation like now where we don't have a working public health system, and all of a sudden you notice that maybe your tax money was in fact going to something. Lots of taxpayers resent paying their taxes because they don't see the benefits that accrue to them. Now let's move to the next slide. What the model we're developing and what the technology today allows you to do is to rethink this to some degree. We're trying to reconceptualize taxpayers as investors and helping taxpayers to see themselves as investors. And the money goes to not the government, but to our government alternative. And Nick, you can hit the button without moving to the other slide. And we'll get, here we go, some animation. This is our substitute government, which will be providing services, hopefully in some ways that work better than how the public sector currently provides them. In my my prior life, I've been consulting to governments for the last 25 years on how to improve the provision of government services. And as I'm sure a lot of people on this seminar can tell you, there's lots of ways in which the public sector can improve its service delivery. And a lot of the things we've heard from people today are the ways in which those services can be provided. And we want to incorporate those along with with the incentives in the marketplace to improve the delivery of these sorts of public services to people that I prefer to think of as entrepreneurs rather than beneficiaries, because better education, better healthcare, better income stability, better childcare, and other sorts of social services actually provide the foundation for people to build better lives themselves if we invest in these things. So we're trying to look at this as an investor entrepreneurial model, and by improving people's lives, we're creating income and wealth that can go back into the common pool and benefit investors directly. Next slide, please. Now, this sort of esoteric discussion, I think, becomes very concrete for people in the context of higher education, which we spent a lot of time on this morning. As most people know, the value of receiving a college education today is roughly $1 million over the course of one's lifetime in increased earnings. It's very easy to see how that creates a long-term earning pool that can create a virtuous circle between investors and the entrepreneurs in whom we make the investments. The current model for higher ed finance does this in some ways. We want to tweak it in a variety of ways that fortunately I can skip over because Fred, the prior speaker, alluded to some of the ways in which you can make the modeling of higher education finance more resemble other sorts of investments and make it more manageable for the people who are receiving the investment to pay it back over time. So you roll all that together and you have a pretty productive model to help people get higher education and for investors to see some market rate of return on helping people to receive those college educations. As I said, I think most people can see this model pretty easily because the $1 million that statistics show you make from a higher education makes this possible and pretty much jumps out at people. Nick, we can move to the next slide. The question is, can you apply a similar model to these other sorts of social services that basically people think, well, we have the government do it because you can't make money doing this. These are money losers. And so there isn't a way to have a productive business model for providing these things. And we basically turn the government into a loss leader that people resent. But in fact, you can create economic models around all of these social service provisions similar to the higher education model. Next slide, please, Nick. I'm going to give you two quick examples. Here on the left-hand side, you see the ROI from a college investment. Basically, income over your lifetime rises by 50% if you get a college education. On the right-hand side, you see the ROI on a fairly rudimentary job training program that was aimed at low education, low income, hard to employ individuals. And in a very short period of time, it creates the same ROI as a college education, basically a 50% increase in incomes. There's a program in Philadelphia that produces a very quick 300% increase from before to after program involvement. So job training produces an ROI at least as good as sending a kid to college, and it's done more cheaply. If we can move on to the next slide. Nick, next slide, thanks. So another example is childcare, which I think most people presume is definitely a money loser and a social investment of sorts that we make that's a money sink. But that is not true. We haven't figured out how you can get a 2-year-old into a 75-year income share agreement like what Fred was talking about for higher education. So you can't really capture the economic benefits to the child, which are in fact enormous. But just from the benefits to the parent, there are studies that show that a moderate income African-American young mother, if you invest in 5 years of daycare for that individual, produces $500,000 in income gain over the course of their working lives, which is roughly half what you get from investing in a college education. But again, it's much cheaper than the college education. So in essence, you get the same return on investment from just about any intelligently planned investment in human capital that you make. So our basic point, you can move to the next slide here, Nick, is that investing in people is one of the best investments you can make, not just for the people who receive the investment, not just for society as a whole, but for those who are making the investments. Now, our goal is to demonstrate to people that you can do well by doing good. So we're trying to create a virtuous circle to support the kind of government services that we used to expect in the 20th century that unfortunately have been declining for the last 40 years and will probably continue to decline in the 21st century. And that's what virtue.us is doing. Thank you.